The winter of 1883 didn't just freeze the Bitterroot Mountains. It buried men alive in silence. They said the mountain didn't care who you were. Not your name, not your past, not your sins. It swallowed everything the same way. Quiet, cold, and without mercy. And if you were unlucky enough to be alone when it came for you, you didn't get a second chance. Colt Hayes knew that better than most. He had chosen this mountain years ago, long before the snow turned cruel. Back when grief still had a voice and didn't just sit heavy in a man's chest. Back when his younger brother Jonah Hayes still laughed loud enough to echo through the pines. The avalanche had taken that sound, took it clean, took it fast, and left Colt behind with nothing but silence. Since then, he had lived alone in a rough-cut cabin carved into the side of Trapper's Peak, a place most men wouldn't dare climb even in summer. He trapped, hunted, chopped his own wood, and spoke to no one unless he absolutely had to. That was the way he liked it. People lied. The mountain didn't. But 3 weeks before the first heavy snow, the mountain reminded him of something else. It didn't forgive. A falling lodgepole pine had come down without warning, snapping under its own weight and pinning Colt beneath it like a broken matchstick. He'd heard the crack of his own leg before he even felt the pain. Most men would have died right there. Colt didn't. He dragged himself out from under the tree, inch by inch, teeth clenched so hard his jaw nearly split. Crawled through mud, rock, and blood until he reached his cabin. Set the bone himself. Splinted it with scrap wood and rawhide. No doctor, no help, no witnesses, just grit. But grit only gets you so far when winter is coming. By the time November crept in, the pain had settled deep into his bones, and the cold had begun its slow invasion. The kind of cold that didn't just bite. It lingered. It crept under your skin and made a home there. Colt knew what that meant. If he couldn't hunt, he didn't eat. If he couldn't chop wood, he froze. And if he froze, nobody would ever find him. So for the first time in 8 years, Colt Hayes did something he swore he never would. He asked for help. The notice he pinned outside Wade Granger's office in Darby was short and to the point. Cook wanted, room and board, $10 a month, must not fear isolation. That was all. No promises, no kindness, just truth. He expected a widow, maybe. Someone older, hard hands, hard life. The kind of woman who knew how to survive without asking questions. But the mountain doesn't give you what you expect. It gives you what you need. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the first real storm began to roll in. Snow flurries danced through the air like warning signs. That's when he heard it. The distant creak of wagon wheels grinding against frozen earth. Colt stepped out onto the porch, leaning on a crude crutch carved from hickory. His breath came out in slow, steady clouds as he stared down the narrow trail. A wagon climbed toward him, slow and stubborn, pulled by 2 tired horses. At the reins sat a young man he recognized, Jeb Crow, hunched over, cursing under his breath as the wind picked up. Colt's eyes narrowed. And then he saw her. She stepped down from the wagon with careful, deliberate movement, boots sinking into fresh snow. At first glance, she looked too thin for the mountain, too pale, wrapped in a worn coat that had seen better years. But that wasn't what hit him. It was her belly. Full. Heavy. No hiding it. Colt's jaw tightened. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Jeb didn't even wait for a proper greeting. He flicked the reins and called out. "She's the only one who answered, Colt. Sheriff said you take her or you don't make it through winter." And just like that, he turned the wagon around and left. No discussion. No second chances. Just snow and silence. Colt looked back at the woman standing in front of him. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Dark hair tucked under a faded bonnet. Eyes steady. Tired, but not weak. "I'm Ayla Redhawk," she said, her voice calm, carrying just enough strength to cut through the wind. "I can cook, I can clean, and I can work." Colt let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You're about 6 months from dropping a child," he said bluntly. "This mountain don't care about that." Ayla didn't move. "If I stayed in the valley," she replied quietly, "we'd both be dead before the snow finished falling." No hesitation, no pleading, just truth. The wind howled between them, sharp and cold. Colt studied her for a long moment. He saw the shaking in her hands, the exhaustion in her face. But underneath all that, something else, something stubborn, something that didn't break easy. He turned toward the door with a grunt. "Get inside," he said, "before you freeze on my porch." And just like that, the mountain had taken in a second soul, and neither of them knew yet. It was about to test them both. If that opening pulled you in, if you felt the cold, the silence, the weight of that mountain, then you're in the right place. Stay with this story, because what's coming next is where survival turns into something far more dangerous. Make sure you subscribe, so you don't miss the next chapter. The door shut behind Ayla Redhawk with a dull, hollow thud, sealing her inside Colt Hayes' world. It was warmer than outside, but not by much. The cabin smelled of old smoke, damp wool, and something metallic that clung to the air like a memory that refused to leave. The floorboards were stained dark in places, scratched deep from boots, claws, and time. A stack of unwashed pans leaned crooked beside a cold iron stove, and dust clung to every surface like it had settled in years ago and never been disturbed. Ayla took it all in without a word. Colt watched her from the corner of his eye, leaning heavily on his crutch as he moved toward the fire pit. He expected it now. The hesitation, the quiet disgust, maybe even tears. Most people couldn't last 5 minutes in that cabin, especially not someone like her. But Ayla didn't flinch. She set her worn carpetbag down by the door with slow, deliberate care, as if she had already decided this place was hers to endure. Then she slipped off her gloves, fingers pale from the cold, and looked around once more, not with judgment, but with purpose. "Where's your water?" she asked. Colt blinked. "Out back. Pump's half frozen," he said gruffly. "I'll manage." She didn't wait for permission. Before Colt could say another word, Ayla turned and stepped right back out into the biting wind, pulling the door open against the storm like it had no say in the matter. Colt stood there for a long second, staring at the empty doorway. Then he let out a low breath and shook his head. "Damn fool," he muttered. But he didn't follow her. Instead, he lowered himself slowly into the worn chair near the hearth, his injured leg stretched stiff in front of him. The dull ache had settled deeper since the cold came in full. It wasn't the sharp pain that bothered him. It was the weight of it. The reminder that he wasn't what he used to be. Out there, weakness got noticed. And noticed things got killed. The door creaked open again, and Ayla stepped back in, carrying a heavy bucket of sloshing water like it weighed nothing at all. Snow dusted her shoulders. Her breath came quick, but steady. She crossed the cabin without hesitation. "Where do you keep your soap?" Colt pointed toward a shelf without speaking. She found it, took it, set the bucket down. And just like that, she got to work. No complaints, no wasted motion. She scrubbed the basin first, rinsing away grime that had been there longer than either of them cared to admit. Then she wiped down the table, pushing aside Colt's tools without asking, clearing space like she was carving order out of chaos. Colt watched her in silence. There was something about the way she moved. Not fast, not rushed, but certain. Like she'd done this before, like she knew exactly how to survive places that didn't want her there. "Don't overdo it," Colt said after a while, voice low. "You ain't built for this kind of work." Ayla didn't stop scrubbing. "I wasn't built for a lot of things," she replied quietly. "Still here." Colt's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer, mostly because he understood it. The hours passed slow. Outside, the wind grew sharper, slicing through the trees with a rising howl that rattled the cabin walls. Snow thickened, layering itself across the world until everything beyond the windows blurred into white. Inside, something began to change. The table cleared. The basin cleaned. The floor, at least the part near the door, scrubbed enough to show the grain of the wood beneath years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time darkness settled in, the cabin felt different. Still rough, still cold, but alive. Colt noticed it when the smell changed. Not gone, but softened, replaced by something warmer. Food. Ayla stood at the stove, stirring slowly, her shoulders slumped just slightly from exhaustion. A simple stew simmered in the pot. Venison, thickened just enough, seasoned with whatever scraps she'd found in his stores. Colt hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. She set a bowl in front of him without ceremony. "Eat," she said. He didn't argue. The first bite hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just food. It was memory. Warmth. Home. Something he hadn't tasted since before the mountain took everything from him. He stopped mid-motion, staring down at the bowl, then up at her. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, voice quieter now. Ayla hesitated just a second. "My mother," she said. "Before—" She didn't finish. Didn't have to. Colt nodded once, slow. "Good," he muttered. "Real good." It was the closest thing to praise he'd given in years. Ayla didn't smile, but something softened in her eyes. That night, the storm closed in fully. The wind screamed like something alive out there, clawing at the cabin walls, testing every crack and weakness it could find. Colt sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Ayla had taken the far side of the room, settling carefully onto a makeshift bedroll. One hand rested protectively over her belly, rising and falling with each steady breath. Neither of them spoke. Didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared, and somewhere deep inside that cabin, beneath the weight of snow and the howl of the storm, something had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something close enough to matter. Colt leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded, listening, to the fire, to the wind, to the quiet sound of another person breathing in a place that had been dead for far too long. And for the first time in years, the mountain didn't feel quite so empty. But Colt Hayes knew better than to get comfortable. Because the mountain always takes something back. And winter had only just begun. Morning didn't come gently on Trapper's Peak. It clawed its way in through the cracks. Colt Hayes woke to the sound of wind dragging its teeth across the cabin walls. The fire had burned low, leaving behind a bed of faint red embers that barely held the cold at bay. His leg throbbed the moment he tried to move it, a deep, punishing ache that reminded him exactly where he stood in the food chain now. Not at the top. Not anymore. He pushed himself upright with a quiet grunt, reaching for the edge of the table to steady his weight. The cabin felt different again, not in the same way as last night. This time it wasn't just the smell or the warmth. It was the order. The place had been put in line. The tools that used to scatter across the table were stacked neat. The floor near the hearth had been swept clean enough to show bare wood. Even the blankets had been folded, not thrown aside like he usually left them. Colt's gaze drifted across the room. Isla Redhawk was already awake. She stood near the stove, wrapped in his spare coat, sleeves rolled just enough to keep from catching fire. Her movements were steady, deliberate, like everything she did. A pot simmered quietly, steam rising in thin white threads. She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. "You're up," she said simply. Colt grunted in response, reaching for his crutch. "Didn't think you'd be." "I don't sleep much," she replied. There was something in her voice that carried more than just the words. Colt noticed it, but didn't press. He limped closer, slow but stubborn, until he reached the table. Isla set a tin cup down in front of him without turning. Hot, bitter, strong enough to wake a dead man. He took a sip and nodded once. That was enough. The storm hadn't let up. Through the frost-lined window, the world was gone, swallowed by white. Snow stacked high against the cabin walls, creeping upward inch by inch, like it meant to bury the place whole. The trees bent under its weight, branches heavy and bowed like they'd been beaten into submission. Colt studied it in silence. "This ain't stopping soon," he said. Ayla followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Then we don't wait for it to stop," she said. "We work." Colt let out a low breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You talk like the mountain listens." "It doesn't," she said. "That's why we move first." That answer sat between them. Simple, hard, true. Colt turned back to the room, scanning what little they had left. The woodpile inside was running thin. Supplies weren't much better. He knew the numbers in his head. How long before they ran out? How fast a storm like this could close every path down the mountain? Days. Maybe less. "I'll handle the wood," he said, already shifting his weight. "No," Ayla answered. It came quick, firm. Colt's head snapped toward her. "I said You'll slow us down," she cut in, not raising her voice. "Your leg won't hold." The words landed harder than they should have. Colt's jaw tightened, his grip on the crutch hardening until his knuckles went pale. "I've been handling myself up here long before you showed up," he said, low and sharp. Isla met his stare. "Didn't back down. And you almost died doing it," she replied. Silence filled the space between them, heavy, cold, real. Colt looked at her. Really looked this time. Not at the coat, not at the exhaustion. At her. There was no fear in her eyes. No challenge either. Just certainty. He hated that. Because she was right. He turned away first, muttering under his breath as he lowered himself back into the chair. "Damn stubborn." Ayla didn't answer. She simply grabbed the axe. Colt watched her pull open the door, the wind immediately roaring into the cabin like it had been waiting for permission. Snow swirled inside, biting at everything it touched. And then she stepped out into it. Just like that. No hesitation. The door slammed shut behind her. Colt sat there for a long moment, staring at the wood handle leaning against the wall where the axe had been. Then at the door. Then back at his leg. His jaw worked slowly. "Hell of a woman," he muttered. Outside, the storm swallowed her whole. But she didn't disappear. Through the narrow crack of the window, Colt could see her moving, small against the vast white, but steady. Each swing of the axe was deliberate, controlled, efficient, not wasted, not panicked. Snow whipped around her, catching in her hair, dragging at her coat. But she stood her ground, splitting wood like she'd done it 100 times before. Colt felt something shift in his chest again. Not surprise? Not anymore. Something closer to respect. Time passed slower after that, measured in the rhythm of her swings, measured in the way the fire inside held steady because of her. When she finally came back in, her breath was sharp, her hands raw and reddened from the cold, but her arms were full of wood. Enough to last the night. Maybe more. She dropped it beside the hearth without a word. Colt pushed himself up, ignoring the protest in his leg. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said, cutting him off again. But softer this time. He paused. She knelt by the fire, feeding it piece by piece until the flames rose strong again, filling the cabin with a steady, living heat. Only then did she sit back. One hand moved to her belly. A small, quiet gesture. Protective. Colt saw it, didn't comment. But he remembered it. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the cabin like it meant to tear it apart. Inside. The fire held. 2 people sat in silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried something new, something earned. Colt leaned back slightly, watching the flames dance. "You ain't what I expected," he said after a while. Ayla didn't look at him. "I'm still here," she replied. Colt gave a slow nod. Yeah, she was. And for the first time since that wagon rolled away. Colt Hayes stopped waiting for her to break, because deep down, he was starting to understand something the mountain had already figured out. Ayla Redhawk wasn't something fragile brought up to die. She was something that could endure. And out here, that made her dangerous. The mountain didn't warn you when it decided to take something. It just did. The storm had eased by morning, but not in any way that mattered. The sky was pale, washed-out gray, and the wind had settled into something colder, quieter. Snow lay deep across the ground, hard-packed in places, slick as glass in others. That kind of quiet wasn't peace. It was waiting. Colt Hayes stood just inside the doorway, leaning on his crutch, watching Ayla Redhawk step out onto the porch with a bundle of wet cloth in her arms. Steam rose faintly from them in the freezing air. Laundry she'd boiled the night before, now stiffening in the cold as she hung each piece along a rough line stretched between 2 posts. "You don't gotta do that today," Colt said. Ayla didn't turn. "It'll freeze either way," she replied. "Might as well freeze clean." Colt huffed under his breath, shifting his weight as a dull pain crawled up his leg. "You're gonna wear yourself down," he muttered. Ayla clipped the last piece of cloth to the line and paused, one hand resting briefly at the small of her back. Just for a second. Then she straightened again. "I'll stop when I can't stand," she said. Colt didn't answer that. Didn't like the sound of it. She stepped carefully across the porch, boots crunching lightly against the packed snow. For a moment, everything seemed steady, controlled. Then her foot hit a patch of black ice. It happened fast, too fast. A sharp slip, her balance gone in an instant, followed by a hard, jarring fall that echoed through the quiet morning like a gunshot. Colt's head snapped up. "Ayla." The crutch clattered to the floor as he lunged forward without thinking, pain tearing through his leg like fire. He didn't slow. Didn't hesitate. By the time he burst through the door, Ayla was on the ground, her body curled slightly, one hand gripping the snow, the other pressed tight against her belly. Her face had gone pale. Too pale. Colt dropped to his knees beside her, breath coming hard. "Talk to me," he said, voice rough, edged with something close to fear. "You hurt!" Ayla's eyes were shut tight, her jaw clenched as she fought to pull air back into her lungs. She gasped. "I slipped." Her fingers tightened against his sleeve, gripping him with surprising strength. "The baby—" Colt didn't wait for the rest. He slid one arm beneath her back, the other under her legs, lifting her clean off the ground like she weighed nothing at all. She was cold. Too cold. And lighter than she should have been. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him, the wind slamming against it in protest. "Stay with me," he muttered, lowering her carefully onto the bed. "I'm fine," Ayla whispered, though her voice didn't carry much strength behind it. "You ain't fine," Colt snapped. He pulled a thick fur over her, tucking it around her shoulders with a gentleness that didn't match the roughness of his voice. "You don't move," he added. "Not today. Not tomorrow if I say so." Ayla let out a weak breath, her eyes finally opening to meet his. "You'll need the fire," she said. "And water. I'll handle it." That stopped her. Colt pushed himself upright, his leg protesting hard enough to make his vision blur for a second. He grabbed the edge of the table until it steadied. Then he moved. Slow. Uneven. But determined. He fed the fire first, shoving fresh wood into the flames until they caught strong again, heat spreading through the cabin like a living thing. Then he limped toward the water bucket, hauling it closer with a grunt. Every step cost him. Every movement reminded him exactly how broken he still was. But he didn't stop. Behind him, Ayla watched in silence. "You shouldn't be doing that," she said quietly. Colt didn't look back. "You shouldn't be out there falling on ice," he shot back. That ended the argument. For a while, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of fire, and the wind dragging its breath across the walls. Colt set a kettle over the flames, then leaned heavily against the table, catching his breath. "Hurts?" he asked after a moment. Ayla's hand still rested over her belly, fingers spread protectively. "It scared me more than it hurt," she admitted. Colt nodded slowly. He understood that. Fear had a way of cutting deeper than pain ever could. He moved back toward her, lowering himself into the chair beside the bed with a controlled exhale. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softer this time, Colt said, "You call me Colt." Ayla blinked slightly. "What?" "You've been saying Mr. Hayes like I'm someone worth that," he muttered. "I ain't." A faint flicker of something crossed her face. "All right," she said. "Colt." The name sounded different in her voice, quieter, closer. He didn't comment, but he noticed. Ayla shifted slightly beneath the fur, her breathing evening out. "You should rest too," she said. Colt shook his head. "I'll sit. You've been on that leg all morning. And you've been on yours since you got here." That almost sounded like a truce. Almost. Ayla let her eyes drift closed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Colt stayed where he was, watching, listening, making sure her breathing stayed steady, making sure the fire didn't die, making sure nothing else slipped out from under them. Outside, the mountain waited, silent, patient, unforgiving. Inside, something else had taken root, not just survival, not just necessity, something stronger, something neither of them had asked for. Colt leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze resting on her for a quiet moment longer. Then he looked toward the door, toward the endless white beyond it. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Jonah Hayes was buried beneath the snow. Responsibility. Not for himself, but for someone else. And out here, that could get a man killed, or it could give him a reason not to die. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, slow, relentless, like something that had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the third night after Ayla's fall, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. The wind changed first, no longer sharp and restless, but deep and constant, like a low growl rolling through the mountains. Colt Hayes felt it before he saw it, the kind of storm that didn't pass through, the kind that stayed. "Get more wood inside," he said, voice tight. Ayla didn't argue this time. She moved quickly, pulling in what she could from the porch stack, arms straining under the weight. Colt tried to help, made it halfway to the door before his leg gave a warning jolt that nearly dropped him to his knee. He caught himself on the frame, jaw clenched. "Damn it," Ayla glanced back at him. "Sit down," she said, firm but not unkind. Colt didn't move. I heard you," he cut in. But he didn't step forward again. He couldn't. That truth sat heavy between them. The first real blast of snow hit just after nightfall. It came hard. Wind slammed against the cabin like a living force, rattling the walls, clawing at the roof. Snow drove sideways, thick and blinding, piling up against the door in heavy, suffocating drifts. Within hours, the world outside disappeared. Gone. Just white and noise. Inside, the fire burned strong, but it wasn't enough. Not for what was coming. Colt tried to ignore it at first. The heat in his leg. The slow, creeping burn that started near the break and worked its way upward. He told himself it was just strain. Just the cold settling in. But by midnight, he knew better. His hands shook. Not from the cold. From the fever. Ayla noticed before he said a word. She always did. "You're burning," she said, kneeling beside him, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. Colt pulled away slightly. "I've had worse." "Not like this." He didn't answer, because she was right again. The infection had turned on him. What had been a clean break was now something else, something angry and alive beneath the skin. His leg throbbed with a deep, pulsing pain, each heartbeat pushing heat through his veins like fire. By morning he couldn't stand, not even with the crutch. The man who had survived avalanches, starvation, and years alone on the mountain couldn't make it across his own cabin. Ayla helped him to the bed, without saying a word. No pity, no fear, just action. "You rest," she said. Colt let out a weak breath, staring up at the ceiling. "Not much use, am I?" he muttered. Ayla didn't look at him. "You're still breathing," she said. "That's use enough." The storm outside grew louder, the kind of sound that swallowed everything else. Wind screaming through the pines, snow grinding against wood, the whole mountain shifting under its weight. Inside, the balance had changed. Completely. Ayla was alone now, alone against the storm, alone against the cold, alone against time. The woodpile shrank faster than it should have. The fire demanded more, always more. And the only way to feed it was to go outside. She wrapped herself in Colt's heavy coat, the fabric hanging loose around her frame, tied a scarf across her face, pulled her gloves tight. Then she opened the door, The storm hit her like a wall. Wind tore at her instantly, dragging at her clothes, stealing her breath before she could even take it in. Snow rose to her knees, then higher with each step. But she didn't stop. Step by step, she forced her way forward. To the woodpile. To the axe. The first swing nearly threw her off balance. Not from weakness, but from the force of it. The axe bit into the frozen wood with a dull crack. Again. And again. Each strike slower than the last. Each breath harder to pull in. Her back ached. Her arms burned. Her lungs fought for air in the freezing wind. Inside her, the child shifted. A reminder. A warning. But she didn't stop. Couldn't. Because inside that cabin, Colt Hayes was slipping away. When she finally staggered back in, arms loaded with wood, her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Snow clung to her hair, her coat, her lashes. She dropped the wood beside the fire and fed it fast, hands shaking from cold and strain. The flames answered. Barely. She moved to Colt next. He was worse, skin slick with sweat despite the cold, breathing uneven, eyes unfocused, delirious. Jonah, he muttered, voice rough and distant. Don't go out there. Ridge ain't stable. Ayla stilled. That name. She dipped a cloth into the water, wringing it out before pressing it gently to his forehead. You're safe, she said quietly. You're not there anymore. His hand shot out suddenly, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. I couldn't get to him, Colt rasped, eyes open but seeing something else entirely. Snow was too deep. I dug. I kept digging. His voice broke. I left him there. Ayla felt it then. Not the storm. Not the cold. The weight of something buried deeper than both. She placed her free hand over his. You survived, she said softly. That's what he would have wanted. Slowly, the tension drained from his grip. His hand loosened. His eyes closed again. The fever still burned, but something inside him settled. For a moment. Ayla stayed there long after, watching him, listening to the storm, feeling the ache in her own body grow sharper with each passing hour. She was exhausted, cold, hurting, but she didn't stop. Couldn't. Because out here, there was no one else coming, no rescue, no second chance, just her, and the fire, and the man she refused to let die. Outside, the mountain raged. Inside, Ayla Redhawk held the line. Alone, the storm didn't break. It loosened. By the fourth morning, the wind had dropped from a roar to a long, hollow whistle that moved through the trees like a warning instead of a threat. Snow still fell, but slower now, softer, as if the mountain had spent most of its anger and was simply watching what remained. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. Because Ayla Redhawk refused to let it die. She moved slower now. Every step carried weight. Every breath came with effort. The long hours without sleep had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands, once steady, were now blistered raw from the axe handle and the cold. But she kept moving, because Colt Hayes was still alive. Barely. He lay where she had left him, tangled in blankets and furs, his massive frame reduced to something fragile by fever. The heat in his body had broken sometime in the night, but it hadn't left quietly. It had taken its toll. His breathing was shallow now, uneven, his skin pale beneath the rough stubble of his jaw. Ayla knelt beside him, pressing her hand gently to his chest. Still there. Still fighting. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You don't get to die, she murmured under her breath. Not after all this. Colt didn't answer, but something in his face had changed. The tension was gone. The storm inside him had passed. Now, it was just a question of whether he'd come back from it. Ayla pushed herself to her feet, her body protesting every movement. The room swayed slightly, but she steadied herself against the table and kept going. Water. Fire. Always those two things. She moved to the stove, feeding another piece of wood into the flames, then reached for the kettle. Steam rose, thin and steady. It was enough. For now. When she turned back toward the bed, her boot caught against something on the floor. A coat. Colt's heavy canvas coat, the one she had worn out into the storm again and again. It must have slipped off the chair sometime during the night. She bent slowly, picking it up. And that's when something fell. A folded piece of paper slipped free from the inner lining, drifting down onto the floorboards like it weighed nothing at all. Ayla froze. For a moment, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she crouched, her fingers hovered over the paper. She already knew. Even before she opened it, she knew. The moment her hand touched it, something cold settled deep in her chest. A memory. A warning. A past she had run too far to outrun. Still. She unfolded it. The paper crackled softly in her hands. And there it was. A name she hadn't spoken out loud in months. Rhett Vance. The sketch was rough, but clear enough. Hard eyes, sharp lines, a face that carried violence like it belonged there. Below it, the words cut deeper than any blade. Wanted, dead or alive armed robbery. Murder. Reward. $5,000. Ayla's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. That part of her had already burned out. Behind her, the bed creaked. A low sound. Colt was moving. Ayla didn't turn right away. She just stood there, staring down at the past she had tried to bury beneath miles of distance and silence. "You gonna tell me?" Colt's voice rasped from behind her, rough and dry. "Or you gonna let me guess?" She closed her eyes for a second, then turned. Colt Hayes was awake, barely propped up on one elbow, his face drawn tight with pain and exhaustion. But his eyes, clear, sharp, focused on her, on the paper in her hands. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. Colt gave a faint, humorless breath. "Ain't it?" he muttered. His gaze dropped to the poster, then back to her. "That your husband?" The word hung in the air. Heavy. Ugly. Ayla nodded once. "Yes." Silence followed. Not the quiet kind. The kind that waits. Colt leaned back slowly, his jaw working as he stared at the ceiling. "Minor, you said," he murmured. "Cave-in." Ayla didn't look away. "I lied." Colt let out a dry breath through his nose. "Figured." Another pause. Then, "Who else knows you're here?" That question landed harder than the rest. Ayla's grip on the paper tightened. "No one," she said. "I made sure of it." Colt's eyes shifted back to her. "You sure about that?" "I didn't use my name until I reached Darby," she replied. "And even then, only because Wade Granger required it." Colt swore under his breath. "That man talks more than a saloon drunk with a full bottle." Ayla stepped forward now, the paper still in her hand. "I didn't bring this here to you," she said. "I ran from it." Colt studied her. Long. Hard. "You don't run from something like this," he said quietly. "It follows." Ayla swallowed. "I know. The fire cracked behind them, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney. Colt looked at her again. Really looked this time. Not just the woman. The weight she carried. The truth she hadn't spoken. "What did he do?" Colt asked. Ayla's voice dropped. "Everything you see on that paper," she said. "And worse." Her hand moved, almost unconsciously, to the small silver locket at her throat. "He wasn't a man," she added. "He was a storm." Colt didn't interrupt, didn't push. He just listened, and in that quiet cabin, with the mountain still holding its breath outside, the past finally stepped inside. The past didn't leave when the storm did. It stayed, hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Colt Hayes didn't say much after that, didn't ask more questions than he needed to. That wasn't his way. Out on the frontier, a man learned quick. Dig too deep into another person's past, and you might not like what you found. Or worse, you might understand it. He sat there for a long time after Ayla Redhawk spoke, the crumpled bounty poster resting on the table between them like a loaded gun no one had picked up yet. Finally, Colt reached forward, grabbed the paper, looked at it one last time. Then, without a word, he tossed it straight into the fire. The flames caught fast, curled the edges, devoured the ink. Ayla watched it burn, didn't move, didn't breathe. By the time it turned to ash, something inside her loosened. Just enough. "The pass is buried," Colt said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "Ain't no one coming up here till spring thaw." Ayla looked at him. "You don't know that." "I know this mountain," he replied. "Better than any man dumb enough to chase ghosts through it." A beat passed, then softer. "You're safe. For now." Those last two words mattered. Ayla nodded slowly. She understood. Out here, nothing was ever certain. Not safety, not tomorrow, not even life. Days passed. The storm had broken, but winter still held the mountain tight in its grip. Snow remained deep, the air still sharp, but the silence had changed again. It wasn't threatening anymore. It was waiting. Inside the cabin, something else had changed, too. The distance between them had shortened. Not gone, but thinner. Colt moved more each day, his strength returning in slow, stubborn pieces. The fever had taken its share, but it hadn't taken him. Ayla made sure of that. She worked less outside now. Colt didn't allow much of it, and spent more time inside, resting when she could, though she rarely admitted she needed it. Instead, she listened, watched, learned. One morning, Colt sat at the table, carefully loading cartridges into a worn revolver. His movements were slower than before, but steady. Ayla stood nearby, arms folded lightly across her stomach. "You ever fired one of those?" Colt asked without looking up. "No," he nodded once. "Then it's time." Ayla frowned slightly. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do," Colt cut in, finally glancing at her. "Out here, you don't get to need things. You get to be ready." She held his gaze. Didn't argue again. Colt pushed himself to his feet, grabbing the rifle from the wall. A heavy Sharps, built for power, not comfort. He handed it to her. The weight surprised her. "You hold it like this," he said, stepping behind her. "Firm, not tight. Let it breathe with you." His hands guided her stance, adjusting her grip with careful precision. His voice dropped lower as he spoke, calm and controlled. "Don't fight it. Aim where it matters. And when the time comes—" He paused. "You don't hesitate." Ayla swallowed, nodding once. She understood more than he realized. Outside, the snow reflected the pale sunlight, stretching wide and endless. Colt set up a rough target, a piece of wood wedged against a drift. "Take the shot," he said. Ayla raised the rifle. Steady. Focused. Her breath slowed. The world narrowed. She pulled the trigger. The sound cracked through the valley, sharp and clean. The recoil hit her hard, knocking her back a step, but she held on. Colt watched closely, then nodded. "You'll do." A faint breath left her lips, not quite relief, something stronger, understanding. The days stretched on like that. Work, rest, training, silence. But beneath it all, something else was building, not spoken, not named, but real, until the day the pain started. It came without warning, a sharp pull low in Ayla's abdomen that made her freeze where she stood, one hand gripping the edge of the table. Colt noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ayla didn't answer right away. Her breath hitched. Then, "It's too soon." Colt's chest tightened. "How long?" "Not yet," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. "It shouldn't be now." Another wave hit her. Stronger. She bent slightly, gripping the table harder this time. Colt was already moving, fast as his leg would allow. "Sit," he ordered, guiding her towards the bed. "Easy." Ayla shook her head, panic rising now. "No, something's wrong. It's not time. It hurts too much." Colt didn't let her finish. He lifted her. Carefully, but without hesitation. Set her down onto the bed, already reaching for blankets, for water, for anything that might help. The fire roared higher as he fed it more wood. The cabin grew hotter, tighter, the air thick with tension. Colt stood there for a moment, staring at her, really seeing her now. Not the worker, not the survivor, a woman in pain, a life about to begin, or end. Fear hit him, hard, colder than any storm, but he buried it, same way he always did. "You're not alone," he said, voice steady despite everything. "You hear me?" Ayla's eyes found his. Wide, uncertain, but holding on. Colt nodded once. "I've got you." Outside, the mountain stood silent again. Watching. Waiting. Because something bigger than survival was about to happen inside that cabin. And this time, the fight wasn't against the storm. It was against fate. The mountain had taken plenty from Colt Hayes, but it had never asked him to bring life into the world. Not like this. Not alone. Ayla Redhawk's breathing filled the cabin. Sharp, uneven, breaking between clenched teeth as another wave of pain tore through her. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Colt stood beside the bed, frozen for half a second too long. Not from fear of the mountain, from something worse. Helplessness. He forced it down. "You stay with me," he said, his voice low but steady. "Don't fight it. Just breathe." Ayla shook her head, sweat already gathering along her brow. "It's wrong," she gasped. "It's too early. Something's not right." Colt didn't have answers, didn't have training, didn't have anything but instinct and grit. And right now, that had to be enough. He moved fast, stoked the fire until the cabin burned hot, heat pushing back the cold that clung to the walls. Set water to boil. Grabbed every clean cloth he could find, most of them cleaned by Ayla herself just days before. He didn't think, didn't stop, because thinking would have slowed him down, and slowing down wasn't an option. "Look at me," he said, kneeling beside her. Ayla's eyes found his. Wild, searching, afraid. "You made it through that storm," Colt continued. "You kept me alive when I should have been dead. You hear me?" Another contraction hit. She cried out, her body tensing hard against the pain. Colt didn't let go. "You're stronger than this," he said, firmer now. "You fight through it, same way you always have." Time lost its meaning after that. Minutes stretched, hours blurred. The only thing that mattered was the rhythm. Pain. Breath. Hold on. Again. 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 Outside, the sky had cleared into a sharp, endless blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete it almost felt unreal. Inside, it was war. Isla fought for every inch, every breath, her strength, quiet and enduring, now pushed to its limit. Her voice broke against the strain, her body trembling with exhaustion as the labor dragged on longer than it should have. Colt stayed with her. Never stepped away. Not once. He wiped her brow with a damp cloth. Kept her breathing steady. Held her hand when the pain came too fast, too hard. "You're close," he told her, even when he wasn't sure. "You're doing it." At one point, she grabbed his shirt, pulling him closer with surprising force. "I can't," she gasped. "Yes, you can," Colt cut in immediately. No hesitation, no doubt. "You don't get to quit now." Her eyes locked onto his. Something steadied there. Not hope. Not yet, but something just as strong. Will. The final stretch came hard, violent. Ayla let out a cry that echoed through the cabin, raw and unfiltered, carrying everything she had left. And then, it broke. A sharp, sudden silence followed, for one heartbeat. Two. Then, a cry, small, fierce, alive. Colt exhaled hard, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. "There you go," he muttered, voice rough with something he couldn't quite name. He worked quickly, hands large but careful, clearing the child's airway, wrapping him in a clean cloth. A boy. Strong lungs. Fighting already. Colt turned, placing the child gently against Ayla's chest. For a moment she didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared down at him, her breathing slowing, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Then her hand lifted, shaking. She touched the child's cheek, and something in her face changed. Softened. Broke open. "He's here," she whispered. Colt stood beside the bed, watching them. Something shifted inside him. Not like before, not slow, not uncertain. This was different, heavy, final, like something had settled into place whether he was ready for it or not. "What'll you call him?" he asked quietly. Ayla looked up at him. Her eyes were tired, but clear. "Eli," she said. "Eli Hayes." Colt froze, just for a second. The name hit deeper than anything else that day. Hayes. His name, given freely, without asking. He swallowed once, slow, then nodded. "Eli," he repeated. The child stirred slightly, his small cry fading into something softer, calmer. For a brief moment, everything was still. No wind, no fear, no past chasing them down. Just a woman, a man, and a child, in a cabin carved into the side of a ruthless mountain. But Colt Hayes knew better. Peace like that didn't last. Not out here. Not for people like them. He stepped towards the window, pulling the edge of the curtain back just enough to look out. The snow had begun to melt. Not much, but enough. Enough to reveal the path below, enough for tracks to form, enough for something, or someone, to come through. Colt's eyes narrowed. There, far off in the distance, movement, small but steady. Riders, 3 of them, coming up the trail. Colt let the curtain fall back into place. The silence inside the cabin shifted again. Not peaceful anymore. Tense. Waiting. He turned back toward Ayla, toward the child. His jaw tightened. "They found us," he said quietly. Ayla didn't ask who. She already knew. Because out here, nothing stayed buried forever. And the mountain always gave you just enough time before it took something back. Colt Hayes didn't waste time explaining. He never had. "Get up," he said, already moving. "Take the boy." Ayla Redhawk didn't argue. Not this time. She wrapped Eli Hayes tighter in the blanket, her movements slower than usual, her body still weak from childbirth, but her hands steady, focused. "What do we do?" she asked. Colt crossed the room, grabbing his Winchester from above the hearth, working the lever with a sharp, practiced motion. The metallic click echoed through the cabin like a warning. "We don't get found," he said. He pulled back the rug near the center of the floor, revealing the trap door beneath it. The hinges creaked as he lifted it open, cold air rising from the darkness below. "Root cellar," he added. "You get down there, stay quiet. Don't come out unless it's me." Ayla hesitated for half a breath, then nodded. She stepped toward him, Eli held close to her chest. The baby stirred slightly but didn't cry, like even he understood the danger creeping closer. Colt handed her his revolver. Heavy, cold, final. "You remember what I showed you," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Hammer back. Don't rush it. And if that door opens, I shoot," Ayla finished. Colt gave a small nod. "That's right." For a moment, neither of them moved. Something passed between them. Not fear, something deeper. Ayla shifted Eli slightly, then lowered herself carefully into the cellar. Colt helped her down, his hand steady despite the tension building in his chest. "You're not alone," he said quietly. Ayla looked up at him. "Neither are you." Then she disappeared into the dark. Colt closed the trapdoor and pulled the rug back into place, covering every trace. Just as the sound reached him, hooves. Slow, heavy, close. Colt moved to the door, grabbing his hat from the peg and settling it low over his eyes. He left the rifle leaning just inside the frame, close enough to reach, far enough to stay hidden. Then he stepped out. The air hit him sharp and clean. The snow had softened, melting into patches of mud and slush beneath the morning sun. And there, in the center of his clearing, sat 3 men on horseback. Not locals, not even close. Their coats were dark, worn from travel. Their horses were lathered, sides heaving from the climb, and their eyes cold, calculating. The man in the middle tipped his head slightly. "Well now," he called out. "Colt Hayes, I presume?" Colt didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, then, "You're a long way from anything worth finding," he said. "Turn around." The man smiled, thin, unpleasant. "Name's Silas Creed," he said. "Pinkerton Agency." That told Colt everything he needed to know. Behind Creed, the 2 men flanking him shifted in their saddles. Briggs Hale, lean, twitchy, fingers already hovering near his holster. Duke Rourke, bigger, slower, but with the kind of stillness that meant he knew exactly what he was doing. Hired guns. Colt's gaze returned to Creed. "What do you want?" Creed reached into his coat, pulling out a small notebook, flipping it open like he was reading from a ledger. "We're looking for a woman," he said. "Apache. Goes by the name Ayla Redhawk." Colt didn't blink. "Never heard of her." Creed chuckled softly. "See, that's the thing," he said. "We've been hearing your name a lot lately." Colt's jaw tightened. That so? Sheriff Wade Granger mentioned a pregnant woman heading up this trail, Creed continued. Said she was coming to work for a man with a broken leg. Colt said nothing. Didn't need to. Creed leaned forward slightly in his saddle. And then there's her husband, he added. Rhett Vance. You heard of him? Colt's eyes darkened, but his face didn't move. Creed smiled wider. We caught him, he said. 3 weeks back. Helena. That hit, harder than Colt expected. He didn't last long, Creed went on casually. Bullet in the gut tends to do that. But before he went, he talked. Colt felt the tension build in his chest. Slow. Dangerous. What did he say? Colt asked. Creed's smile sharpened. Said his wife ran off with something valuable, he replied. Something worth a whole lot more than $5,000. Behind Colt, the cabin stood silent. Beneath the floor, Ayla listened. Creed's voice dropped lower. Ledger codes. Bank routes. Enough to track down 50,000 in Union Pacific gold. That number hung in the air like a gunshot waiting to happen. Colt shifted his stance slightly. You're chasing a ghost, he said. Creed shook his head. No, he said. I'm chasing something real. His eyes narrowed. And I'm standing in front of the man hiding it. The wind stirred lightly between them. Not loud, not violent. Just enough to carry tension through the clearing. Creed reached slowly for his revolver. You can make this easy, he said. Bring her out. Hand over the locket. Colt didn't move. Didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't step back. She ain't here, he said. Creed sighed. Shame. The next moment snapped everything apart. Gunfire exploded across the clearing. Colt moved before the sound finished echoing. He threw himself sideways, boots sliding through wet mud as bullets tore through the wooden post behind him, splinters exploding into the air. He hit the ground hard, rolled once, and dragged himself behind the stacked woodpile. More shots followed. Sharp, fast, deadly. Mud splashed up around him as rounds slammed into the logs, chewing through bark and sending fragments flying. Colt's breath came hard, fast, focused, outnumbered, outgunned, and nowhere to run. He pressed his back against the woodpile, eyes narrowing as he listened, hooves shifting, boots hitting ground. They were moving in, closing distance. Colt flexed his hand once, then reached down, grabbing the first solid thing he could find. A heavy chunk of split timber. Not a weapon. Not really. But it would have to do. Because out here, you didn't always fight fair. You just fought to win. And Colt Hayes had already decided no one was walking out of that clearing with Ayla Redhawk. The mountain had gone quiet again. But this time, it wasn't waiting. It was watching. Colt Hayes stayed low behind the woodpile, breath steady, eyes sharp, mud clinging to his hands and coat. The cold didn't matter anymore. The pain in his leg didn't matter. Only distance, only timing. He heard them shifting, boots in the mud, slow steps, careful, hunting. Silas Creed's voice cut through the air, calm and patient like a man who believed the ending was already written. You can't hold that position forever, Hayes. Colt didn't answer. Didn't need to. He shifted slightly, gripping the chunk of timber tighter in his hand, listening for the one mistake that would give him a chance. It came. A step too close. A shadow breaking the edge of the woodpile. Colt moved. Fast. Explosive. He surged up from the mud and drove the timber forward with everything he had left. It slammed into Briggs Hale's chest with a sickening force, knocking the air clean out of him. The man collapsed backward, his revolver firing wildly into the sky. Colt didn't stop. He lunged forward, tackling him into the slush, driving a fist into his jaw hard enough to silence him. One down, but not enough. A shot cracked. Pain tore across Colt's side, sharp, burning, real. He staggered, breath catching as blood soaked through his shirt. Not deep, but enough. Enough to slow him. Duke Rourke was already coming in from the right, revolver raised, steady as death. Colt turned, too late. Another shot rang out, but it didn't come from Rourke. It came from the cabin. A thunderous blast ripped through the clearing, louder than anything before it. The force of it echoed against the mountain, shaking loose snow from the trees. Rourke dropped instantly, the impact spinning him sideways before he hit the ground. Silas Creed froze. Just for a second. And that second was everything. Colt looked up. There, standing in the open doorway, Ayla Redhawk, barefoot against the frozen wood, hair loose, wild in the wind, her body still weak, still recovering, but her stance unshaken. In her hands, she held the heavy Sharps rifle. Smoke curled from the barrel. Her eyes were locked on Creed. Cold, steady, final. Creed's expression shifted, confidence breaking into something else. Fear. He stumbled back a step, raising his weapon, but not fast enough. "Don't," Colt said, voice low, deadly. Creed hesitated, just long enough for Colt to close the distance. He knocked the gun from Creed's hand and drove him down into the mud, pinning him hard with his weight despite the pain tearing through his side. Creed struggled, but it was already over. "You should have stayed off this mountain," Colt muttered. Creed laughed weakly, blood staining his teeth. "You think this ends here?" he rasped. "Men like me, we don't stop. Calder Boone won't stop. That gold—" Ayla stepped forward. Slow. Deliberate. Eli Hayes wasn't in her arms now. She had come alone. Her hand rose to her neck. The silver locket caught the light as she pulled it free. Creed's eyes widened. "There it is," he breathed. Ayla didn't speak. She opened it. Inside, folded tight and hidden behind a small, worn photograph, was the truth. The codes, the map, the fortune that had destroyed everything. She stared at it for a long moment, at the thing that had chased her across states, taken her home, her past, nearly her life. Then, she turned, walked to the edge of the porch. Colt watched her, still holding Creed down, his grip tightening slightly. "Don't," Creed croaked, panic rising now. "That's $50,000. Ayla dropped the paper onto the wood, reached for the kerosene, poured it without hesitation, struck a match. For a split second, the flame flickered between her fingers. Then she let it fall. The fire caught instantly. Bright, hungry, final. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash in seconds. Gone. Just like that. The wind carried the remains away, scattering them across the mountain like they had never existed. Ayla turned back. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clear. "He's dead," she said, "and what he left behind dies with him." Creed stared at the ashes. Something in him broke, completely. Colt released him slowly, letting him slump into the mud. It didn't matter anymore. Not now. The mountain had taken care of the rest. Silence settled over the clearing. Deep, heavy, earned. Colt pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain, and crossed the space between them. Ayla swayed slightly as he reached her, but she didn't fall. Not this time. He caught her anyway, pulled her close. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Everything that needed saying had already been done. Inside the cabin, Eli began to cry. Soft, alive, real. Isla let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "We should go back inside," she murmured. Colt nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We should." He helped her up the steps, guiding her through the doorway, back into the warmth they had fought so hard to keep. Behind them, the mountain stood still. The bodies, the blood, the past. All of it left outside, where it belonged. Days would pass, then seasons. Snow would melt, grass would grow, and somewhere along the line, that lonely cabin would become something else. Not just a place to survive, but a place to live, to belong, to build something stronger than the mountain itself. And maybe that was the only way to truly beat it. Colt Hayes once chose the mountain to be alone. Ayla Redhawk came to it with nothing but pain. But together, they changed it. Or maybe, it changed them. And that leaves one question. Out in a place where nothing is given and everything is taken, what would you choose to fight for?